I'm so happy to be here with Deborah Scott.
Thank you so much for coming, guys. It's so great to see everybody. And if I don't know you, please introduce yourself. And if I do know you, please come say hello.
Remind you.
We haven't seen each other in so long.
And nobody's wearing a mask, so it's even better. So Deborah and I go way back. Okay. We were children 25 years ago, and they let teenagers work on films.
Yeah.
And
it was great.
And Deborah foolishly hired me to run the workrooms in Mexico City. So we had the great Dale Woodman and Karen Nasser running the workroom, and I was in Mexico City doing alterations and building little bits in that. So we it's sort of odd to see all of the Titanic clothes here now, and again her amazing stuff from Avatar. But we're really here to talk about Deborah's career because she's our honoree tomorrow at the Costume Designers Guild. So, Deborah, your career in costume design is so impressive and varied. You've designed costumes from some very iconic films. One of your first films was E.T. Your resume includes Hoffa, Legends of the Fall, Titanic, Patriot, Minority Report, Transformers, the first and second Avatar, The Amazing Spider-Man, and you even worked with Madonna on Who's That Girl?
That's a long, long time ago.
Do you have a favorite costume genre?
I do not. I do not. And the reason I don't is because I think everyone loves doing period work, I'm pretty sure. Like it's really fun to, visit that research and do that whole thing. But I think the funnest part is getting gifted an incredible character, whether it's, shorts and a t-shirt or something glamorous gown. It's, trying to find that note that makes it just right.
Yeah, I think that people think of costume design as like, Marie Antoinette, but putting somebody in a t-shirt and jeans is still character design. So what was your education? Like, what did you study?
I went to college for theater design. So I worked in the theater, and for a while I thought I would be I was like, oh, I could go to Broadway. It'd be so fun. But I think I was so drawn to making movies ever since I was a little girl. And it was kind of just a lucky, easy transition. And once I started, I was hooked, as I'm sure all of you are. So, you can't let it go. Show the business we call show, my friend used to say.
It found you. So how did you get your start in the film business?
Well, let's see. One of the first things I did, which got me into 705, is I worked with Betsy Potter on some television shows that she did, so that was kind of fun. But I think my real big start was a friend of mine, Charlie Martin Smith, who's an actor, was working on a film called Never Cry Wolf in Alaska. And we had gone to college together, and we had done a lot of plays together and, knew each other quite well. And the director's wife was kind of handling the very few costumes in the movie, and it wasn't working out exactly how they wanted it. So he suggested me, and I got a call. I'm like, can you come to Alaska tomorrow? And I'm like, what? Yeah, sure. So jumped on a plane, took a couple of small planes, and had no idea what I was getting into. I arrived on the tarmac in a little, 6-seater plane or something, wearing my Laura Ashley blouse and my blazer and carrying my sewing machine. So I was the one and only member of that costume department, which was challenging.
So you had never worked on a film before. It was your first time on set, and you were the costume designer. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen anymore.
Well, if you're the one and only person, you have to kind of, right? And if the script supervisor didn't feel well, I did that, or I helped with the makeup. It's like those are the ways we could start back then. And I don't know how it is now, right? It was easier to sort of get in and just do it.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting now because now everything is sort of union. And when I got in the business a long time ago, films would turn. So, I mean, I was on Stargate and it turned union. I was on Barbed Wire and it turned union. So I got in the guild. So, I mean, these experiences where you get to do everything, I think is the best learning experience because you learn so much from actually doing it.
Yeah, you're forced to. You have to learn it, or you're at, you would be sent home.
And I love that, you didn't know what were right or wrong. And unfortunately, you had nobody to talk to because you were there by yourself. So I think that really tells a lot about who you are as a person, that you just figured it out.
Yeah, I think that's what we do, right? We're always in situations where you can't be intimidated, and you just say, well, here's the challenge. We're going to figure it out. And that's lifelong on every single film, I think.
And I think in figuring it out, this goes to my next question. when I worked with you on Titanic, I was so impressed with the way you did research. You didn't do what everybody does now is a Google search. I don't think there was Google then.
Yeah.
But I remember you
I think there
actually
were computers.
right. But I remember you like actually reading etiquette books to talk about the neckline of a woman at that era. So it's like your research was very in depth. How do you approach research on your projects?
Well, I think the first thing I do is in my head, I say to myself, okay, if you were really that person, or you were really in that place, or you really lived at that time, how would you be? What would you do? How would you find whatever it is that you put on your body? And so I kind of just try to teleport into the character and then start the research, wherever that leads me. So something like Titanic, it was obviously very important. The etiquette of how people behaved was so important. And it dictated, like, this is when you wear your gloves. This is when you wear a hat. This is when you don't wear your gloves. Very, very, very detailed. So it was an incredibly good roadmap on that particular film. Really, really good.
And you had a long prep, because I remember you had like 6 months before your career even started. You traveled the world buying vintage pieces.
Yeah, I had a couple of people on at the beginning, and my producer John Landau, who is very, very insightful, and I convinced him that we should purchase a lot of vintage garments, which then we had to remake, as you know, remake a lot of them because they were in disrepair. But it was an incredible lesson, because when you see the real thing, and you see, like, especially in that period, the colors were intense, because the photography is black and white. So the color of those things, and it inspired the director, Jim. And it was a really incredible, like, it was, what you tell me, because it was like the hardest thing was to make the things we made as beautiful and intricate as the things that were real. So if you put them together in a scene, there's a level.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is that I remember, one of the first things I did was we relined suits. Like, you'd find these original clothes, and the suit was perfect on the outside, but the lining that touched the body had fallen apart. So you got to take it apart, and then, who gets to take apart a vintage garment to see how they were built inside, which then dictated how we built the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I remember, like, the dresses you would buy had like a 21-inch waist.
Right.
What actor today has a 21-inch waist? So we'd take it apart, and build a new lining, and then make it to 26-inch waist, which is a little more, user-friendly.
And the silk linings were all shot. Like, you'd see this incredible piece of fabric, and they would just crinkle.
Which just tells you that the things that touch the body did not hold up. But I mean, but it's amazing, like, even to see, one of Kate's dresses that she wore for 2 hours is held up over 25 years. Well, you were buying dresses that were 80 years old that were still holding up. So it's really a lesson in how to preserve costumes.
Yeah.
And as far as research, I mean, now, obviously we know how you can research Titanic. How did you approach Avatar? I mean, what was your inspiration research for Avatar?
Well, that was an interesting little journey, because I came in on the first film. I took over for a couple of other designers that had started the project. And so I went into this like, oh, what's this? What kind of world is this? Without really very little knowledge. Again, it was, John called and said, hey, can you come to New Zealand tonight? And I'm like, sure, because you do, right? If someone, you know when those experiences and those opportunities are going to be there for you. You don't say no. You don't say, oh my God, my winter coat is in storage. So there was kind of the template of what the world could be. But starting with film 2 and, reading the script, and they're so protective about the scripts that you couldn't give the scripts to your own crew.
Wow.
So you're saying, okay, here's the story, kinda. I can't really tell you, but I can tell you little bits and pieces. So, you sort of plop down in this imaginary world, and we, all the characters had moved on from film 1. I wanted it to be a lot more elaborate in a way than film 1, and we had the technology and the ability to do that. And it was really kind of the new clan, the Metkayina. We knew we're going to be living on the ocean. So we just started to do, Hannah, my ACD, is, raise your hand. she's a, and other people, she's a master researcher. And and Beth Konigsberg, who's 705, she's, we spent a lot of time doing research, looking at every book we could possibly find. The internet is tricky because, you can't trust it.
Right.
So, but we did a lot of research in books, and we started to look at, like, okay, cast a really broad net all over the world. Doesn't matter what the climate is. Doesn't matter as long as they live on or near the water. So we started to look at indigenous peoples everywhere. And the first thing you find, which is the same thing with the period movie, is that there are so many links between cultures that someone in Europe, is wearing the same hoop skirt as someone in South America. It's like, how does this happen? Even in times when technology and communication isn't so perfect. So we started to see the same things in those kinds of peoples, which was really fascinating. Body art, the fact that I've talked about this a lot, how they usually make their clothes out of what they find in their environment. Makes sense, right? It's just like the rule book is so clear when you do that research. So Jim, we knew that it was going to be a warm climate in the movie. So we sort of settled on the sort of greater Polynesia. But we'd research people in India, China, everywhere, Antarctic, Arctic, so we started to find these commonalities. And we settled kind of in this basic area. And I think also Jim really was, one of his main things was the hair, which luckily I got to design at that point because it was in design phase, and we never had a makeup or hair person for the virtual world, only for live action. So I got to design the characters from head to toe.
Including the props, which people don't realize. Right. Everything that they touch is Deborah.
Anything on their body, a knife, I think. We were the only ones there. The production designers were busy doing environments, but no one was, all the live action, all the masks, all the everything, all the gear, everything. So it was a very complex and going in a lot of different directions, but settling down into that Polynesian world and really focusing on hairstyles, which I had two really great artists here in LA, Christian Cardella, one of them here today, and Keith Christensen. And we would just do hairstyles on a character and present them to Jim and say, that's the person. So that was super duper fun because then no one could mess it up. No one, you got to create the whole person.
You draw a great costume and you have this idea for hair, and then the hair and makeup department is completely different world. So it's great that you had the freedom to complete the look, including the props, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And I think that we all look at these costumes and you're like, oh, I recognize that. But what I was talking to Deborah about, they're not on Earth. She didn't find a conch from Earth. She didn't find a bird from Earth. She had to invent the pieces and then design within those pieces. And I just think that as an artist, I'm just thinking about it and I'm overwhelmed. I can't imagine but you realize that every single piece there is something that she thought up and then made and can you sort of go through that process?
Yeah, it's such an interesting process. And the wonderful part about it is that process of design, especially if you have enough time, but it doesn't matter if it's 2 weeks or 2 years, the process of design is ongoing, right? Once you finally make it, okay, it's made, it's done. But you go on to the next garment. And in a made up world like this, I had this wonderful team here and then we moved to New Zealand, and I had an amazing team at Weta Workshop, Flo Foxworthy, right there, who runs, and we sort of developed a whole new textile department there. And working with a group of incredible artisans that you then started to understand your designs by making them.
And I'm sure they evolved. So and you had years to do this. So by the time you're getting to you started costume 1 2 years ago and you're doing costume 20 3 years later, you're like, wait, I could have done something different.
Absolutely. But that's always right. Every time you do you can do a beautiful ball gown and you can say, oh, I could have made it purple. Yeah. Whatever. There's always that. And there's things that you might be more proud of than others. But I think the techniques and the things that we learned by doing them, by designing them and making them, was invaluable and ongoing. And the fact that then we've already, not a spoiler alert, we've already made all the costumes for film 3. So, which are, I think, amazing. I mean, because they're more evolved.
And you also, it's what you've learned over this decade on this project.
So all the language.
I can imagine what number 4 is going to look like, because you're going to know even more.
Yeah. So it was, so it's an ongoing, wonderful experience to be able to do that.
And I mean, for instance, the Navia are not human proportions.
No.
But you make your samples in human proportions so bodies can wear them.
That's right.
And then you were telling me that once this is a sample that the digital artists copy off of, but then you have to do another version in white for movement that goes in the water. I mean, so I think to understand her design project, it's not just you think, oh, she made that, but there's so many. Can you go through the levels of how you have to get there to make it to camera?
It's so complicated, and we didn't know anything when we started. I mean, I'm like the lamest person on a computer. So it was a huge learning curve. And I would always have to be like, looking around like, can you help me? So it's really important to have genius people around you, like Shay, who is, and Hannah, but people who are really keen on computer work and could explain things to me. But it was a quick learning curve. But the whole production was learning. No one had done exactly this before. So all the computer programs were being developed at the same. So there was all these. It's very, very complicated. But for us, the design process led, right? You still designed the costumes. You started with that. And I knew that we were going to be able to make each one. If it had just been on paper, it would never have looked like this, ever. Never, ever. So the process is basically concept art, sample, and this is just the manufacture part, right? So there's a whole computer part beyond this, but sample. And then we would refine the concept art to look more like the sample. Because I dare say that the artists, as brilliant as they were, and the concepts that were brilliant from the group of designers here and in New Zealand, they're not detailed enough or fine enough to be then in a movie of this technological wizardry, right? So the making of the pieces becomes the 3D kind of map that the computer artist can then follow. Then there's a sort of interim which we call, what do we call that? We called it so many things, but the diagram, we just, it's like it had so many stupid names, but we developed this process because as we were trying to give the digital artists a roadmap so they couldn't mess it up, right? This is sample 1860. So they got all the pieces, they got all the art, they got all the diagrams and said, like, you better do it like we say. So it's different than the production design because the production design is almost all concept art. Right. And then they refine it. The digital artists can refine it and move things around and, give you different angles according to the camera. But it was as if they couldn't mess it up. They couldn't change it. The only thing
they could mess it up.
They couldn't. Yeah. And they did. There's things that I can go back and pick out and go, oh, we saw it earlier. So, but it was about as foolproof as you could get it.
I mean, she was explaining the process to me. Like they made a sample and they wove it. And you take the picture of that to the digital artist. Well, the digital artist doesn't just draw it. The digital artist has to literally take a line and then weave it in the program. So she's trying to teach, nerds, how to create. So I mean, like, I can't even imagine how frustrated, because in her mind, she's had 3 years to develop this. And now you have to explain it to somebody.
Yeah. Well, you hope that the sample speaks for itself. And because the computer technology can read it, but it still has to go through their animation, their simulation. And it's like all of a sudden, now you're in the fitting room with the nerds. And
digital artists.
Which they were wonderful and they're amazing. And I honestly, it's an incredible art form. They're making the bodies of the characters. And some of them are actually based, quite frankly, on our original designs. Because Jim would see like, ooh, that's cool. So it informs a lot of people, which is really
you're
incredible.
Responsible for all the markings on the body too.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So they and then we just go through a very, very long process of virtual fittings, as I call them, where sometimes they do a turntable. Sometimes they didn't because they didn't want to take the time and the money. The movie's incredibly expensive. And we go, where's the turntable? I go, we're not doing that anymore. Well, what are you doing? We're going to put it in a shot. It's like, what shot can I see? You know, so there's a lot of, that's when it gets incredibly tedious because the fittings go on for months and months and months. And you're saying, could you make it longer? Could you make it shorter? It doesn't move right. It's not the right color. Or your director comes in and says, I don't like that color, which is the easiest thing to change. Thank God. It's like, okay, what color do you want? You know? So it's a very interesting and new process. And I think it's one that I very much feel like I would love to thank you for being here because it's an educational thing. It's a kind of design. It's a kind of movie that is opening a new door.
It's the future of costume design.
It's the future of costume design, or at least part of costume design. Right? And that there are new jobs, more opportunities. You know, you have a supervisor and a digital costume design assistant who can stay on the project for months. You have a room full of incredible textile artists. So that if something needs to be changed or altered or put in the pool or put in front of a Ritter fan, they can help you. So it's just a huge job opportunity that we should not deny ourselves as being actually real.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, there's students here today. You know, when I got into the business 37 years ago, I know how to sew and I'm here because I sewed. But this next generation of costume designers and costume crew, you're going to need to learn the digital part of it because at certain point, the digital artists aren't going to be able to understand it. So the costumers, as opposed to being on set working with an actor, they're going to be working with Deborah and like, this is how you weave this. I think that this is, I mean, I remember watching Avatar 10 years ago and thinking like, oh my God, this is the future of costume design. We're not always going to build it. I mean, she gets to build one, and also think of like what you've heard how difficult it is to make one costume. She does every single extra, and there were crowd scenes. That's all her and her team. Like it's just, I mean, how
a lot of work. Sometimes you can limit it down. Like if it's something, you know, you might be able to just do the front or do a really explicit drawing and have a partial sample for the background. We sometimes did that because for money, and also then you do all this work and like all these color variations, and then the digital people, you're like, wait, I see the same guy 6 times standing next to each other. And then you go crazy. Like, can you change this one? Or, you know, so, but it's a very, very long process. And I think it's one that I like to think that you know, they could take the designs on paper and say goodbye, but they didn't do that for good reason.
It would look very different if you weren't involved.
Very different. But the fact that we as costume designers and assistant costume designers and 705 people and artisans deserve a seat at that table that is recognized and admired and validated by the artists. Absolutely. And Jim Cameron did do that. John Lando, my producer, did do that. They valued the work. So it's...
I mean, I think we're always fighting for money and time and crew. How big is your crew? And I mean,
well,
I mean, how big is your team? I mean, because it's monumental. I mean, the small details that have to be worked out.
Yeah, well, you're doing multiple things at once. Performance capture, where you have to make all the performance capture suits,
which you had to develop, and they don't exist.
The water ones didn't exist. So when we decided to shoot underwater with performance capture, they didn't even have the technology to do it. They showed up in our office one day with a string. It looked like a gnarled up bunch of Christmas lights. Here, I'm like, here what? What? Here, what do you mean here? You know, so it was incredibly long. It took 8 months to get the technology inside the proper kind of suit, so that each actor, and down to putting sensors on toes and fingers, could be captured underwater.
Now think about that. How many times have you had 8 days to figure out a costume? 8 months before they could film.
Before we could film. So we're doing that. We were also preparing live action, which was a ton of, you know, masks and props and helmets, and the brilliant team that from what I was led by Lance Hansen mostly, who did that was, you know, I mean, 3D modeling came in super handy. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about the materials that you could 3D model. So I would be what's that? You know, so you just have to keep learning, and it's important to do that. And it's so invigorating. And I think with the costumes themselves, We do have some things in some of these samples that are 3D printed, but we realized very early on, the real thing looks like the real thing. If you can make it out of the real shell,
to control reality.
yeah, controlled reality. So like this neck piece, it went through a bunch of changes, and it's important to know that the concept art that we often show isn't the costume that ended up in the
Final
movie.
piece.
It's not the final piece. So it's just like if you do a sketch.
That's true concept art as opposed to illustrations that are done after the costume finished. It's concept.
We revised it down so that the art that we submitted was exactly like the sample, right? So there's no confusion, because when we didn't do that at the beginning, there would be great confusion between, there's lab artists that work for this. It's basically a live storyboard, right? That Jim and the other people are using to film a virtual camera. They'd plop something in there, like, excuse me? And then Jim gets used to seeing it. You're like, that's not the real costume.
So you have to be everywhere all the time.
Everywhere all the time. You have to be ever vigilant that they don't mess it up. So Jim was really good about the fact that he knew that some of these costumes would be placeholders that he was looking at, that they were still being made, developed, and it would change. But it was difficult when we had to use stage pieces for performance capture, so that if someone was wearing a cape, the actor could act with the cape. Headpieces, so that if not even so much that the actress could feel it, but that the way the lighting would cast from her headpiece to the person standing next to her. And that was very new to me. So we kind of messed that up a couple times and got in a bunch of trouble. Oh well. But we carried on, it worked out. So we were doing that live action, and then we were doing all the Na'vi costumes. So it was very so the question was, how many people? So the stage crew for the tank and the performance capture was probably maybe up to 5 people, something like that. Supervisor, the regular supervisor, coordinator, assistants in the office, the sort of the digital people that helped with all, because it's a tremendous amount of book work just to make sure that you're supplying everybody with the proper information. And I think at Weta Workshop at the maximum, and that includes live action, woodworkers, everything down. You can walk into that place and you say, I'd like it to be, and they're like, let us help you. So they're incredible, but maybe at the maximum, maybe 45 people.
Wow.
But as we sort of went along, we could have really honed it down to a base group of around 6 or 7. And this was my textiles team that Flo ran. And then when we, as needed, we'd say, oof, we need to carve something. And you'd bring in somebody from the department of props who could carve. And some of these people were absolutely brand new to it. A computer artist, a guy who did 3D modeling, never carved in his life. Okay? And then all of a sudden he's doing, and it was the best part about it is you didn't have to repeat it. You didn't have to carve it a shell exactly the same way each time. So you just set these amazing people who can work with their hands loose. And then I walked up to him, I'm like, I think he was actually carving wood, right? So he was sort of sculpting. Like, so how'd you learn this? Was your grandfather teach you how to whittle? It's like, what the? And he's like, no, I just started a couple weeks ago. So the thing to find the people that around you that have these amazing talents, and they stay quiet, right? They don't speak up sometimes. So you have to, and I like this piece went through about 3 iterations that it wasn't really working. And we sat down and I brought in all the sculptors, okay, guys, what got any ideas? What are we going to make this out of it? What's it going to look like? How's it going to, so we had to talk it out for me too. Like, I'm willing to take ideas from anybody and then go away and kind of make it work.
The best idea wins.
That's right. And it's often a combination of ideas, because also we're like, okay, here's a grand thing you can draw, but you can't make it, but you really can if you really, it's just, they work hand
and like
in
I
hand.
said, it's not based off anything on Earth, so it doesn't have. It's, because you were saying, like, they would ask you what kind of flowers. You're like, I don't know, a Na'vi flower. It doesn't exist. But you have to have that person on your crew who is creative, who can say, okay, it's an ivy flower, and then go from there, as opposed to like, what is the exact flower? I mean,
Right.
As a costume designer, we're in charge of all of it. It's literally like, but I can't even imagine the levels that you had to maintain.
It's also the thing with the animators and the simulators, because they don't have a program that tells them how heavy that is, right? So we'd have to go through like, okay, it sits like this, it's woven like this. When he leans forward, when he, so if you watch the film really closely, there are times where you can feel the weight. That's not by accident. That's by a lot of hard work. And sometimes, it's not as refined as you want it to be. This one, the sample is very beautifully and intricately woven. This is one of probably the first pieces that Digi got. They never really got it. They just didn't. And there's a point where it has to stop because they got to move on. There's time, there's money. You're under the same constraints as you are on any film. So they're like, it's the best we can do. And you're like, okay, you got to take it, and so then you got to let go. You got to let go. But I think as designers, you also go, there's a moment where you're like, should I have dumbed that down? Or do I let it go, have it not be perfect? And this one was the same way. This was a very early design, a very early build. We learned a lot from this one. And it's not great in here.
See, it's funny. We all think it's great. I'm right. We all think this is amazing, but I love that to Deborah's eye, it could have been better.
Could have been better. Can we fix that? So you can fix things to a point, and then some things you do have to let go, but they don't know what that is. The animators and simulators don't know what that is, so they
one doesn't exist, so she can't say, well, it's like this.
Right. So they get to see it. They can touch it if they want to. They put it, So they have to build the programs around the costumes. And because these are bespoke, one-of-a-kind, unique pieces, it's a huge challenge for a giant group of people, the thousands of people that work at Weta FX.
So do you have an estimate of how many costume pieces you built for this movie?
Did we finally estimated like...
Designed, not built, but designed. Because you didn't build every single
designs. We went through I think between the film 2 and 3, over 20,000 designs on paper. So you're constantly revising, right? Like, I like that, but I don't really, So working with these incredibly good artists who do work in computers, but are part of the costume shop. So, which is important because they don't, I don't know, the way it works, it's like having something on paper isn't really
right.
the process.
I almost think that you would want to have your own team of digital artists in the costume department that you can teach and spend the hours with them, and then take that to because even when you're going to describe it to the heads of the department, she's not talking to the person that's going to do the technical work. You're talking to their boss, and that boss has to interpret it. So you're going to do even within
Weta Workshop, the thing that became very apparent was that the designers are all in one room drawn away, the textile artists are all in another room making stuff, and we would have to almost drag them in. Mm-hmm. Please come in and see and some of them were much more interested in the actual real thing. So come in and see what we're working on, see how it looks, so that your drawing can be better. You have more understanding of what. So it's a very involved process with a lot of people communicating, and a lot of times with words. When you're a designer, you have to talk about it with adjectives, right?
It's flowy, it's wispy, it's willowy.
That's not quite substantial enough. Let's make it a little more airy.
What does airy mean?
So,
but I guess that's also where you get to work with the same people over and over again. And speaking of that, you have long-lasting collaborations with directors and producers. Can you tell us about that process and how it makes your job either better or worse? You've known James and John for
a long time. I actually met John on Hoffa. He was the studio exec. And he came out because it was kind of a financially troubled project, and it was a huge undertaking. And he came out to sort of be the, lay down the law from the studio. But he taught me an important thing, which was what he didn't do was do that. What he did do was go around to the entire crew and say, what's working? What's not working? What do you need? What can we do better? And this open communication that you need to have, it was invaluable. So the communication between directors and yourselves, and a lot of directors, I'm sure you guys know, aren't very communicative, or they don't communicate in a way that, or they sort of short circuit, I think, when, even though everyone wears clothes, they still kind of like, they just like short circuit when you start talking about something. So the hurdle is to gain their trust. Once you get their trust, you can kind of be on your merry way, right?
Which is probably why James keeps hiring you, because at this point,
it's like, and then we have this conversation where he'd look at something, and then after a while, he stopped. He didn't have to see the real garments because he was seeing them. His judgment was after the digital work. But even when he was first seeing them, he would look at it and go, "That's pretty." And then
that's a huge compliment from James.
But then his mind would go, because he's a scientist, he'd go, "How does that work underwater? That's never going to work underwater." I was like, "Oh, okay, I'll prove to you it does work underwater. We did that on Titanic. We got into swimming pools with people in gowns. And then once you did that, it was like, okay, fine, you can let it look pretty,
I met your daughter. Full disclosure, Hannah is not only Deborah's assistant, but she's her daughter. I met her when she was 6. And I worked with your husband, Tim, as a DP. How have you balanced, because this sounds all encompassing. How have you balanced having a family and working as a costume designer? Because it just seems like all encompassing.
Well, that's
obviously hiring your daughter is probably smart.
Or not. We had to redefine our communication skills in the office.
Right, because you're Mrs. Scott, the director. And
yes, you're Deb Scott. You're not mom. And I'd be like, you can't roll your eyes at me in the office. It's like, you can't do that. So it's a really fruitful, wonderful relationship, because you can excuse a lot of things and you can develop a lot of things. You kind of know each other. And
you could also make her work 7 days a week because she's at home with you.
Yes. Especially during lockdown. It was really,
because I think our crews are our family, but you literally have crews that are your family. But it's like I said, I can't imagine how you have time to go to the grocery store and do what you do. So it's
I think there are many people in this room that struggle with that. And I struggled with it for sure. And there are things that you have to sacrifice. You don't necessarily get to go out and have a beer with the crew because you got to go home and be the tooth fairy. So you have to choose. It demands an incredible group of colleagues around you, childcare providers, teachers. My God, my husband.
He's probably mom and dad. Because on Titanic, the kids didn't come with you.
No, he brought them down to Mexico every weekend. So you got to find that in your community, whether your community and families are all different kinds and assortments now, right? But you have to find a community of people that support each other. And you have to know that you're not necessarily, I've turned down projects. He's turned down projects. You just kind of carry on and keep your eyes on the prize and do your thing and hope that you're doing right by everybody.
Well, I think it's pretty remarkable that you just to see what you've designed as a designer, you really are a masterclass, and you're not pigeonholed. I love that you've done.
Oh, thank you.
Who's that girl to Titanic? It's like I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you.
And I'm sure there's a million questions out there. So let's open it up to you guys.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Trish.
Hi, Trish.
So your samples were only for the digital virtual stuff. What was your live action costuming?
So the live action part of it is a lot of uniforms in film too. It's all the humans that come back to Pandora. So there's that, right? And it gets more complicated in film 3. But the samples were worn a lot by actors to inform their performances.
The actual actors?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But they didn't have to match the digital stuff exactly. If they were there for informing the actor, then it wasn't completely necessary that they completely matched.
Well, yeah, no, eventually they're going to match, right? Because the performance capture happens very early on. By the time we are working with post-production and putting all the stuff into the digital world, the actors are kind of long gone. They might come back if you're missing a piece of this or that, but they're no longer there. So,
but I think to your point, the actors don't film the actors
in the costumes
because the proportions are off.
Right, and the only thing, like we one time we had to dress up Cliff Curtis, who plays Tanawari, and Jim broke the bracelet. You know, it's like I'm like, you know, but it's amazing how it worked.
Yeah.
You know, the nerves of like, oh my God, are you for real? You're gonna put that on him? But you put it on him, and you put the fan on him, and everyone's just like, oh my God, it works. You know, it's weird, but it was informative.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Okay, first of all, brilliant. All the things that you've done, and Back to the Future also.
Thank you.
The hot guy avatar, I don't know his name, that's what I'm going to call him. His chunky necklace, I am so obsessed with it. I want to touch it, but what are those pieces? What is it made of?
Okay.
It's from Navi. It's an animal you don't know.
It's Navi. It's Pandoran. It's actually, well, the centerpiece is meant to be some kind of bizarro tooth. Jim's obsessed with teeth for some reason, right? I mean, let's be real. It's like, so I try to like, how can you do that without it being too obvious, you know? And so that's basically a 3D printed piece with some things overlaid, inlaid. Obviously, there's woven leather keeping the whole thing together, but the big pieces around are chunks of real paua carved. Sometimes we would use a laminate paua if you needed to get a particular shape. It's sort of,
what's
am I right, Flo? Yeah.
Shell.
Mm-hmm. Shell. And I would go out on the weekends and collect lots of shells, and then I'd bring buckets of weird stuff in and say, like, you know, we're gonna make the costume out of this. What?
But you had the luxury of being able to then to go to somebody to build it. Like, this doesn't exist, but with this color, this texture, make me.
Yeah. Do you have the Renal top? The Renal top. This is how this started. Was that I was beach walking one weekend and I found a teeny tiny. Huh? Yeah. No, you don't have it. It's just kind of this waterfall. I almost walked by it because there's so many beautiful shells on the beach and in New Zealand. And I went back and it was like this perfect soft cylinder of shell. And we were working on that top and it just wasn't kind of getting there quite. And I went and I said, this is it. And it's going to be like this waterfall down her chest of all these pieces. So they started carving little bits. Sometimes we'd use, like I said, inlaid so that you can get, if it was too hard of a shape, but shell's really hardy and really, it's very, very fun to work with. And Jim's obsessed with it because that was like, my God, so sparkly. You know, it's like.
I love that he still likes sparkle.
I love it. It's like a sequin. So, mm-hmm. And you have to consider too with the art, the digital side of it, this costume makes noise, right? We hear that in real movies. Like you hear the tinkle, tinkle.
Which the sound guy's going to kill you when they put it in post, but.
Yeah.
Were you able to find it?
All right. Okay, cool. Anyone else with a question before we go back? Yes.
Oh, I have a question. Titanic, there's a particular scene. The ship, the departure of the ship. Mm-hmm. I heard you had to mirror everything because the placement of the ship was on the dock is incorrect. So how did you deal with that scene?
Do you remember that?
Yes. They only built one half of the ship.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, guys. So
it's in most clothes of that era are very asymmetrical. Deborah was tasked with making everything symmetrical because of the fact that there was only one half the ship, and they flipped the negative.
Right. So he would flip the negative. So sometimes, you know, if you'd see the real dress and it had some fringe on this side, then it would be on that side. So you go, okay. But it was very important when you had things like double-breasted suits, you had to make sure that they closed both ways. All the printing on all the hats was
Titanic
backwards.
And the sweaters. And then make sure that everybody put on the reversed one.
And they're like, wait, no, you can't be there. Yours actually does say, you know. It was fun though, right?
Oh, but it was like a puzzle, and everybody had to be on top of their game. But I mean, I just remember, like, you know, it was like that was her frustration, is that really it's this there was a drape and she had to everything had like a center seam because you couldn't. Mm-hmm. So this is what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's the one.
So is that digital? Is that fake or is that real shell?
Well, it's mostly real shell.
Oh, okay.
It's real. And it's on a wired kind of macrameed over a beautiful base. Very simple, really. I mean, it is. It's only a few
Okay,
elements.
now, if this
and
is
it
a film,
tinkles,
you'd
it
have to
makes
make 20,
beautiful
and you have to make just one.
Yeah, you only have to make one. This is the
A
brilliance
question in the
of
back?
it.
And that's what I was going to ask you here. They put eight knots and how to make all the vaults when you design.
The what?
That you don't have to make.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And because the language that you develop building things with your hands and having people, the brilliant people who worked for me, build with their hands, I don't even think they could duplicate what they did.
And that's the
Because you're
beauty
sort
of it.
free-forming it, and that's how you and that's why, in a way, that's why I love film 3, because we've really hit our stride in understanding the language of the costumes we were building. And that's kind of for us, but you hope it translates to the audience too. But yeah, it's very nice not to have to make a multiple.
And I'm assuming that the digital artists are getting better each film. Like now that you taught them how to weave digitally.
It's really frustrating with hair too, because they only have a couple of simulations that they use, and it starts at the root of the scalp. So you're like, no, and they'd always put too much hair on a person. Like the kid, like she turned, the little girl, she turned out with this massive thick, and you're like, no, look at the concept art. She's she's like a little flirtatious imp. Anyway.
Any other questions out there? Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in terms of turning your physical costumes into digital, was there ever like a actual scanning process of these garments?
Oh yeah. They scan everything, inside, upside down, backwards, every way they can do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's how they teach the computer. Yes, Dave, the mission will be accomplished.
Bill in the back.
Since you guys created a bunch of plays, like floor and bottom, you created a bunch of stuff. Did you do that in stages to take, say, it's the difference between fresh flowers versus dry flowers, or grapes versus raisins? Were you, you know what I mean? How it changed? Were you doing that so then you have more stuff to play with to design?
I think because you would know, like a piece of flax, like what it looks like when you take it off the plant, and then how it looks much later. So you can sort of choose where you want it to be. And sometimes we would use different materials to mock that, say, but it's that part's kind of fun because it's like the observance of nature. That's so important. But you also kind of get to say, like, you know what, I'd like to have it be flax, but it's actual purple. So let's, so it can be quite imaginative, and we can all get drugged down with how hard every single day is at work. We've all been on many projects where I'm sure, it feels like a grind, but you really need that time to step back and be able to let your imagination go and be able to step back and look at something and go, that's really perfect. I love that. So that's what you have to, I think we all need to remember as we toil every day, to also enjoy those things that you create. I don't even know if that answered your questions, but yeah.
I know there's some students here. This is probably one of the rare opportunities to ask somebody like Deborah a question. So any other questions out there?
Yep.
Could you walk us through this piece, just like a little?
It's spectacular.
This piece is actually, I think, from this movie, one of my favorites. And I think it was so because it was incredibly difficult. We went through probably 3 design phases. And it was never quite right. It was never the thing that you have in your mind. And because you can make it up, it's almost like, then you really feel like you're failing yourself because you're like, you can make this up. So we went through a bunch of iterations of it, and it was always too heavy. And it was really difficult to come up with the idea of how to integrate the weaving and the structure and the flowers or the leaves or the Pandoran flower leaves or whatever they are. So when we hit upon this one, it kind of got really helped by the 3D, the centerpiece is 3D printed. It was helped by the 3D modelers, right? So they could start to say, like, we could do this. And I knew I wanted, eventually, the reason I really love it is because I think it shows strength, right? It's a power piece, but it's so delicate. It's so feminine. And they did a really beautiful job of the digital process of it. But so we 3D printed it. This was the third time around. And a really wonderful artist named Yasmin at Weta did the weaving and made the leafy flowers. So it was just trial and error. Like, here's a bunch of flowers. How should we go? Which one should we choose? How do we change it? A little bit of this, a little bit of that. So it just, once it got there, it was like that. It's very fragile though. So no one could actually, it was hard to, we sort of put it on somebody once and then like,
you traveled it here.
it could break.
I have another question. Like, yeah, all day. Hair, body art, costume. Do you always start with the costume, or did Jim come and say, "Hey, I want this girl to be a little more feminine or a little more," was there an order? Did that? I know it evolved, but
yeah, I think we worked because when you're drawing a sketch, we always put the head on, so we just automatically did that. It was just automatic. Kiri, Sigourney Weaver's character, in the original kind of concept art that the production designers had, she had long braids like Neytiri. She's supposed to be 15. She's kind of her own, a free spirit. It's like, I'm like, no, that makes her look like she's 30. It's like, this is completely wrong. So we started playing around with this kind of different, that part was super fun because as we're developing the costume, we're also developing the hairstyles. That's right. So you can see like, she's kind of a collector. She's a little avant-garde. She doesn't fit the mold of all the rest of them. And how do you show that? So that was fun. And also Sigourney was very involved. She would come to our office and wander through. We had a little kind of museum setup of pieces, and she'd just wander through and pick things up and, go away, come back. So it was really nice to be able to give her that kind of, because it's also with the kids too. Those kids didn't know, they'd never done anything like this. So we did about a week-long kind of thing of putting them in costumes and letting them run around and get used to the idea that, yeah, you're kind of naked, but so what, right? So that they knew what it felt like. So that working with the actor, it's just different, but it's kind of wonderful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you still have that personal involvement with the actors? They get to know you.
Absolutely. And a lot of times when they would come in, like when Kate was cast and she came back and we're like, old home week here with the Jim Cameron film. And, Jim would say, Deb, come down, bring the designs. Let's see what she's going to, let her hold some of the pieces and see the artistry that's going to go into this and get her all excited. Get
inspired, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Another question there. Yeah.
Again, the body art, the body is completely painted. Is that part of the costume, or where is that part from it?
The bodies are never really painted. That's the digital artists, right? But they have their body paint, their stripes. Everyone has individual stripes. We didn't do that. That was mostly established in the first film. Then they have these little bioluminescent dots, and the Americana clan don't have body art. This clan, because it's very apparent in a lot of Polynesian cultures, we had to develop the tattoos. So we did do that, and we did that kind of we did it mostly on naked bodies, but we kept the idea of the costume in mind, and then we would put it together and see how it looked.
Anybody else?
So I just had a question because you were mentioning all of this is brand new. It's never existed before. And I kind of remember when the first Avatar came out, there were reporters and things saying this is the end of costume design. We won't need them anymore. We can just, animate everything.
Who are those people?
Yeah. So, but it seems like it's the opposite, that it's actually opening up new doors for us, and it's really going to expand the workshop and give us more opportunity to create more things for more people on 4 worlds.
100%. 100%. And I think that that's something that needs to be embraced. Right. Next time anyone does an animated movie, even if it's simply animated, you say, look, I'm not just dropping a design. I'm not just dropping a design in some fabric. You're going to do the whole thing, and that you need to make the play that you're going to stay there and work with the digital artist. So it turns out how you wanted it.
Right. So do you think, and like as you're making this whole series of movies now, is there kind of like this organic way of like there's going to be costume specific programs where it's like this is the digital weaving program that everyone should use from here on out?
Well, I'm
like,
sure.
are we going to see it in Star Wars and Marvel and things like that?
Well, that's it's a really good question because I don't know about how proprietary that stuff is, but I'm assuming the programs that Weta FX develops,
I think if you go to Weta, they have it all.
Yeah.
Their artists figured out how to do it.
Right.
So I'm sure the next project they have, they'll, like we learned how to weave. and then Deborah Scott should be getting a commission because she taught them. Talk about ownership.
Yeah, exactly. So we have strides that we need to make.
Yeah. And in the fight for pay equity, we need to add this to the list. Anybody from pay equity here?
Yeah. And also, I think it's also a really important point because the public at large, the fans, and many of maybe even some of you in this room, but when you first see a movie like this, you assume it's the production designers and the digital artists.
Just today we learned how much of it is you, the costume designer, and when they're taking, they don't give us the credit for what we do, but it's the costume department that did the hair, the props, and developed the technology for them to film this in the next movie. So it's like it really shows the value of costume design in ways that we couldn't have even thought about 5 years ago.
And you're right that the expansive nature of the jobs that we can now claim, right? You can be an assistant costume designer now and do what she does. Right? That's unbelievably important. So for us as a community to embrace all these new technologies and jobs and opportunities, claim it as ours, instead of going, oh, you didn't do that. We don't.
It's not your department. You don't. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that we educating the public so they know the vast amount of work that the costume department created on this. I mean, I think it's probably more than any film that's out there right now. Nobody has this much responsibility. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming today and sharing your vast experience with us. I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank our incredible team at the CDG, Ivy Thade, Brigitte Romanoff, Anna Wyckoff. Literally, Ivy called me and said, I'd like to do a panel with Deborah. I called Deborah. Deborah said yes. And then Ivy put this together in less than a month. So Ivy, thank you so much.